Simultaneous speech about totalitarianism and the use of propaganda. And I'm going to specifically focus on representative democracies. That is to say, most modern Western-style democracies that we can find in Europe, in the United States, and in other countries. And at this point, you're probably thinking that seems like a contradiction. How can she possibly be talking about totalitarianism in representative democracies when these are governed by the will of the people? Well, I hope that this contradiction will resolve itself as we go further through the speech. But to understand what we're really talking about, we need to look at where our current systems of government come from. And if we go back in time, we can see that most representative democracies are based on the values of the Lumières, that is to say, a group of French philosophers whose ideals brought about the French Revolution and then spread throughout Europe. At the heart of this ideology was the social contract, as defined by Rousseau, a French philosopher. It stated that people have inalienable rights which can never be surrendered to a leader or to a political party, but they can be put aside in order to serve the common good. That is to say, that individual will is always trumped by the common good, as defined by the social contract. This leads to a problem known as the tyranny of the majority, which philosophers and politicians have been trying to solve for centuries. The problem is that in totalitarian systems and representative democracies alike, a very narrow group of elites define this common good. And unfortunately, a lot of these elites think that they know better than the people, due to the fact that they often come from elite education systems where contact with the common man is very much lacking. A case in point is that 2/3 of Boris Johnson's cabinet are privately educated, and 1 in every 2 heads of state in France over the past 30 years was educated at the prestigious National School of Administration. In Republican democracies, representative democracies, an illusion of freedom is necessary, and the tyranny of the majority is a vital tool in ensuring public compliance. This goes hand in hand with a huge public relations apparatus, which, if we define it in its true sense, is really propaganda. And it sounds like something that comes from World War II in order to boost troop morale, but most of us aren't aware of just how very pervasive propaganda is in our daily lives. Let's go back in time once again and have a look at the father of propaganda, Edward Bernays. He just so happens to be the nephew of the well-known psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, and he used his uncle's knowledge of the human mind in order to help governments and corporations influence public opinion. Some of his successes, we might say, were his Torches of Freedom campaign, which was to encourage women to smoke so that tobacco manufacturers could sell more cigarettes. And he likened cigarettes to torches of freedom, with the obvious uptake of smoking after this. This was around the year 1929 that he rolled out this campaign. And he also acted as press officer for Woodrow Wilson and managed to completely flip public opinion to be in favour of entering World War I. And this is quite remarkable when we take into account that Woodrow Wilson was elected on an anti-war platform. Let's take a quick quote by Edward Bernays. He said, "Those who manipulate the unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our countries." Edward Bernays also coined the term engineering of consent. And in a strange twist of fate, his grandnephew is the co-founder of the ultimate propaganda tool, which many of us willingly submit to for several hours per week, and this is Netflix. Propaganda often takes the form of information. In fact, in the 1995 State of the World Forum, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former counselor of US President Jimmy Carter, coined the term tittytainment. This is an easily digestible, hypnotic form of entertainment that was designed to placate the masses and to quell uprisings before they even began. All of this stemmed from the observation during this same forum that large swathes of the population stood to lose their jobs and lose all prospects as technology advances. One of the key methods in order to subvert public opinion is distraction. And we can see this on a day-to-day basis in TV, films, series, infotainment, notifications that flash up on our mobile phones. All of this occupies available human brain time, and it stops us from asking the big questions or even realizing that the big questions exist. What better way to bring in new standards and values than by bombarding humans with them when their defenses are down, when they're relaxing in front of the TV? What better way to blunt critical thinking than with trash TV programs and social media which celebrate ignorance? And if we flip over to the news, we can just see a permanent stream of anxiety reporting on all the calamities occurring all around the world. This leads to a constant low level of fear, which is the ideal breeding ground for totalitarianism. Also, these calamities are great for diverting our attention. Does anyone remember Special Advisor Joe Moore stating after the 9/11 attacks that it was an excellent day to bury bad news? In fact, an age-old technique is to use a problem or to instrumentalize a problem and then push a solution. Naomi Klein documented this very well in her book Shock Doctrine, which showed how the free market has dominated the world, not through freedom of choice, but through using shocks such as market collapse, coup, war, terrorist attacks, in order to push through pro-corporation legislation and increase surveillance of the masses. We could look at the Patriot Act, for example, which allowed the US to commit torture and to use drone warfare. This was only supposed to last 4 years after the 9/11 attacks, but it's still in force now. Or we could look at the French state of emergency between 2015 and 2017, after the terrorist attacks in France, which has now become permanent, transposed into national legislation, and accepted by public opinion because the state of emergency became the status quo. Totalitarian moves progressively, step by step, until it becomes accepted by the population. We could look at our current situation. Look how lockdowns and restricted measures are always leaked a few days in advance and then debated by the press in a sort of game of will they, won't they, before they're finally passed. In this way, it becomes normalized in our collective psyche. We've heard it talked about so often that it doesn't surprise us anymore, and we accept it. We can liken it to an abusive relationship, where the abuser repeats the same things time and time again until the victim ends up believing them. Totalitarianism plays on our childhood trauma and our fear of punishment, and in fact, fear is at the heart of totalitarianism. It's the best way to encourage a population to surrender their rights for greater protection. And we can see this in recent anti-terror legislation that has been passed in France just a few days ago, taking advantage of the climate of fear in order to push through draconian security laws which legalize drone surveillance. The thing is that we all have two parts to our brain. We have the emotional automatic brain, which processes emotions such as fear and disgust. And then we have our logical brain, which allows us to make reasoned decisions. However, when our emotional brain is switched on all the time, responding to a stream of fear, our logical brain is switched off. Next time you watch the news, look at how the information is presented and ask yourself, which part of my brain is this appealing to? The emotional brain or the logical brain? Totalitarianism also plays on our need to belong. There's nothing more contrary to human instincts than to behave differently from the majority, and especially when a sense of guilt is instilled in us when we divert from the majority opinion. Look at recent TV adverts, for example, imploring us not to kill our grandparents by going and visiting them. This sort of narrative stops questions from being raised, stops the official narrative from being challenged. If challenges are raised, they're met with a cry of, but you don't care about the elderly. What if it was your grandparents? So we can see here that we have a blueprint for totalitarianism. Distract the people, encourage ignorance, instill a climate of fear, create or instrumentalize problems, and then impose solutions. Play on people's need to belong. Make people feel guilty so they don't raise questions. Divide and conquer. And then, if you're a politician, sit back and implement what you think is best for humanity. Now, this has been quite a dystopian speech, so I'd like to end on a more positive note with a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, the well-known French author. And he said, the French people have never been freer than during the Nazi occupation, which might seem like another contradiction to you. But what Sartre meant was that we're free because we have a choice. And this choice is never more evident or more stark than in difficult situations such as occupation. For Sartre, being free meant choosing to stick to our principles in the worst of situations, choosing not to ignore alarm bells ringing, choosing not to give in to cognitive dissonance, and choosing to have the courage to seek the truth. That's the end.